The Galactic Concord Hall on Station Ythrus 9 was the largest structure ever built by any species in the known galaxy. And on this particular day, every seat in its vast circular chamber was filled with ambassadors and diplomats and representatives from over 300 civilizations who had come to witness what most of them believed would be the quiet death of a young species. Ambassador Kethvorin of the Valhari Dominion stood at the central podium with his scaled hands folded behind his back, and his golden eyes sweeping across the chamber with the calm confidence of a predator who had already cornered his prey. And when he spoke, his voice carried the deep resonance of a species that had been conquering worlds since before humanity had learned to split the atom. "Honored members of the Concord," he began, "the Dominion has shown restraint where others would have shown fire, and we come before you today not as conquerors, but as realists who understand that the Terran boundary cannot sustain itself against what is coming." He pressed a claw against the holographic console, and a map of the galaxy bloomed into light above the chamber. On that map, the Valhari Dominion burned red across 42 star systems, like a wound that kept spreading. Beside it, the Terran boundary sat in pale blue. 9 systems, barely a handful of colonies, a smudge of color next to an empire. "The mathematics are not cruel," Kethvorin continued. "They are simply honest. The honest truth is that humanity fields a navy of fewer than 800 warships, while the Dominion commands 12,000. Their ground forces number in the low millions, while ours number in the hundreds of millions, bred and trained for war since birth." He let the numbers hang in the air, like a sentence already passed. "We do not wish to exterminate them," he said, and his tone shifted to something that almost sounded like pity. "We offer incorporation into the Dominion with preservation of cultural practices and limited self-governance. And this is a mercy that the Drenkai were not offered, and that the Siloxi begged for and did not receive." The chamber murmured its approval, because this was how the galaxy worked and had always worked. The strong consumed the weak, and if the weak were lucky, the strong left them their songs and their languages and their little traditions, as long as they knelt. And every species in this room had either knelt or made others kneel, and they understood the rhythm of it. The Drenkai ambassador sat in silence, with his forearms folded tight against his chest, because his people had been conquered by the Valhari only 2 cycles ago, and he knew exactly what limited self-governance meant. It meant your children learned the conqueror's hymns, and your soldiers fought the conqueror's wars, and your world's resources fed the conqueror's ships, and you smiled while it happened, because the alternative was ash. But he said nothing, because the Drenkai had no voice in this chamber anymore. Kethvorin finished his address and stepped back with the satisfied posture of someone who had already won, and the Concord moderator, a towering insectoid Falari, turned its multifaceted eyes toward the Terran delegation and asked if humanity wished to respond. For a long moment, nothing happened. The Terran section of the chamber was small, just 3 seats allocated to a species the galaxy still considered barely worth noticing, and 2 of those seats were empty, and in the third sat a woman who looked so painfully ordinary that several ambassadors had to check their identification displays to confirm she was actually the Terran representative. Her name was Elena Voss, and she was 53 years old, with gray streaking through dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of too many late nights reading reports she wished she had never received. She did so without drama or flourish. She simply rose from her chair, the way a person rises when they have accepted something heavy and have decided to carry it anyway. She walked to the podium, and she did not look at Kethvorin, and she did not look at the map still glowing above the chamber, and she did not scan the room for sympathy or support, because she knew there was none to be found here. She placed a single data chip on the podium console, and the Concord's translation systems locked onto her voice as she began to speak. "The Terran Union has reviewed the Dominion's terms," she said, and her voice was flat and calm, in the way that still water is calm before something enormous moves beneath it. And Earth declines. The chamber stirred, but she continued without pause. "We will not send diplomats to your warships," she said. "We will not send generals to your battlefields, and we will not kneel in this chamber or any other." Shifted in her expression, not anger and not fear, but something older and quieter, something that lived in the part of humanity that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that burned entire continents, and still came out the other side with clenched fists and beating hearts. "What we send next," Elena Voss said, "you will not find in any codex of war." She removed the data chip from the console and placed it in her pocket, and turned and walked out of the chamber, without looking back, and without answering the dozen voices that called after her, demanding clarification and explanation and reason. The Phylari moderator clicked its mandibles in confusion, and Kethvoron let out a low hiss that might have been amusement. Because he had seen species bluff before, small nations puffing themselves up in their final moments to preserve some scrap of dignity before the inevitable surrender. Within the hour, every communication relay in the Terran boundary went dark. Beacon, every Ansible, every quantum link channel, all of it gone silent, as if someone had reached into those 9 star systems and pulled the plug on an entire civilization. The Concord assumed it was the silence of fear, the quiet that comes when a prey animal freezes and hopes the predator will lose interest. The Valhari assumed it was the silence of surrender, the hush before the white flag. The Drenkai ambassador alone sat in his chair long after the chamber had emptied, and he stared at the door through which Elena Voss had walked, and he felt something he had not felt since his own world had fallen. A cold electric sensation crawling up his forearms that his people had a word for, but that did not translate well into any galactic language. The closest approximation was the feeling you get when you realize the small animal you cornered has teeth you did not see. He said nothing to anyone about this feeling, but he did not sleep well that night. General Torvax of the Valhari Dominion stood on the observation deck of his command fortress on Korath Prime, and watched 12,000 warships hanging in orbit like a ceiling of iron and fire. And he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction, because this was the most powerful invasion force the Dominion had ever assembled, and it was all pointed at 9 small systems inhabited by a species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel 80 years ago. He was a veteran of 36 campaigns, and he had personally overseen the fall of the Drenkai homeworld and the burning of the Siloxy border stations. And he understood war the way a surgeon understands the body, every cut deliberate and every wound calculated. And he had studied humanity's military with the thoroughness of a predator learning the habits of new prey. What he had found did not impress him. Earth's forces were conventional in every sense of the word: infantry divisions and armored vehicles, and a modest fleet of warships that relied on kinetic weapons and basic energy shielding. And their tactics were textbook, and their numbers were small, and their supply lines were fragile. And Torvax had estimated the entire campaign would last perhaps 30 standard days before the last human flag came down. His intelligence officers had compiled a detailed report on human psychology as well, and they had concluded that humans were emotional and prone to internal division, and that their greatest weakness was their attachment to individual lives. They mourned their dead in ways the Valhari found almost embarrassing, and this sentimentality made them slow to sacrifice and quick to negotiate. Torvax read this report and found it comforting. On the 7th night after the Concord session, he was in his bunker, reviewing fleet deployments with his war council. 14 of the Dominion's finest strategic minds, seated around a curved table, covered in holographic star maps. When the lights flickered, not a dramatic failure, but a subtle dimming that lasted exactly 2 seconds, and Torvax looked up and felt the first cold finger of something he refused to call unease press against the base of his skull. "Status report," he said. His communications officer pressed a claw to her earpiece, and then went very still. "Sir," she said, "the orbital defense grid is offline." "Which section?" "All of it, sir. The entire planetary grid. It is not destroyed, it is simply no longer responding to our commands." Torvax stood, and in the time it took him to cross the room to the main console, 3 more reports came in. The ground-based sensor network had gone blind. The communications array was cycling through languages no Valhari system could identify, and something had entered the atmosphere. Not a fleet, not even a squadron. 47 objects falling through the sky in perfect silence, with no transponders and no heat signatures until the final 3 seconds of descent, when they bloomed on sensors like 47 small stars, and then vanished again as they hit the surface. Torvax had 6 million soldiers on Korath Prime, and a defensive infrastructure that could withstand a siege from an entire galactic coalition. And he looked at those 47 contacts and told himself that this was nothing. This was a desperate gesture from a cornered species throwing bodies at a fortress. He was still telling himself this when the first reports came from the outer perimeter. Sentries were dying, not in waves and not in firefights, but individually, one by one in the dark, with a precision that the field commanders could not explain. And the security footage showed almost nothing, because whatever was killing them moved in ways that the cameras could barely capture. Just flickers of black against black, and then another sentry was down, and the one beside him had not even turned his head. Within the first hour, Torvax lost contact with 4 perimeter bases, and the reports that did come through were fragmented and terrified. And the soldiers who survived described shapes in the darkness, human-shaped but wrong somehow, too fast and too quiet, and wrapped in armor that seemed to drink the light around it. The armor. They were not soldiers. Not in any way the galaxy understood that word, because soldiers operated in units and followed orders and fought within structures of rank and discipline. And these humans did none of those things. And each Reaper carried a code name instead of a rank, and they operated on a single shared objective uploaded before deployment. And beyond that, every decision belonged to them alone. They had been selected from a population of 12 billion, not for their obedience or their strength, but for something far more specific, a capacity for violence so controlled and so focused that it could be aimed like a beam of light. And they had been trained not in academies, but in programs that most of Earth's own population did not know existed, and would not have approved of if they did. They were what happened when a species that had spent its entire history at war with itself decided to take all the lessons it had learned about killing and compress them into individual human beings wrapped in the most advanced technology that species could build. Torvax realized this too late. By the 4th hour, his outer defenses had collapsed, not overwhelmed, but dismantled piece by piece by enemies his soldiers could not see and could not track and could not fight, because every time they formed a defensive line, the Reapers simply went around it, or through it, or under it, and the Valhari training that had crushed every conventional army it had ever faced meant nothing against an enemy that did not fight conventionally at all. By the 6th hour, the Reapers reached the command bunker. Torvax heard it happen, the sounds of his elite guard dying in the corridors outside, not screaming, but going silent one after another, like candles being snuffed out. And then the blast door opened, and something walked through the smoke, and the emergency lighting caught the edges of black armor that moved like liquid shadow. Torvax saw, before his consciousness faded, was a faceplate with no features, just a smooth, dark surface that reflected his own terrified face back at him. When he woke up, he was alive. Every member of his war council was dead around him, 14 bodies still seated in their chairs as if they had simply stopped living between one breath and the next. And the precision of it made Torvax's stomach turn, because there was not a single mark on the table, and not a single holographic display had been disturbed. They had been killed so carefully that the star maps were still glowing. Carved into the wall behind his chair, in the Valhari military script, were words that Torvax read 3 times before he believed them. Torvax lives, so Torvax can warn. Tell the Dominion what came for you in the dark. He sat in that room for a long time, surrounded by the dead, and by the silence, and by a fear he had never known in 36 campaigns. And when he finally opened a box of ROPS, communication channel to the fleet in orbit, his voice was something that no one who had ever served under him would have recognized. The fleet scattered from orbit within the hour, not in an organized retreat, but in a panicked flight that left supply ships and transport vessels behind. And as 12,000 warships broke formation and ran from a planet that had been attacked by 47 humans, the galaxy watched through its long-range sensors and began to understand that something fundamental had changed. The Terran boundary was still dark and still silent, but the silence no longer sounded like fear. High Commandant Salith ruled the Valhari Dominion from a throne carved from the bones of conquered worlds, and she had held that throne for 19 cycles through a combination of ruthless intelligence and an absolute refusal to show weakness. And when General Torvax's broken transmission reached her, his voice shaking as he described shadows that killed without sound, she felt something she had not felt in decades. She felt the first crack in her certainty, but she buried it fast because that was what rulers did. And she stood before the Dominion's war chamber and declared a blood crusade against the Terran species, the highest military escalation in Valhari history, an oath that committed every ship and every soldier and every resource the Empire possessed to the complete destruction of the enemy. They sent 47 assassins, and we ran, she said to her assembled commanders, with a coldness that could have frozen starlight, and that shame will not stand. Because we are the Valhari, and we do not flee from mammals in metal suits. The commanders roared their approval, because the blood crusade was sacred, and the Valhari had never lost one. And the full might of 42 star systems began to mobilize for total war against 9. But Earth was not waiting for them. Earth had been listening through the silence, and in the weeks that followed the fall of Korath Prime, the Terran boundary disgorged 300 more Reapers, not as a fleet and not as a force, but as individuals and pairs sent out into the Dominion like seeds carried by a dark wind. And they did not attack military targets in the way that any species expected, because they were not fighting a war. They were waging something else entirely. They were waging fear. On the frozen training world of Drek 4, the Valhari maintained their largest military academy, a brutal institution where young Valhari were forged into soldiers over 6 years of training. Physical and psychological conditioning, and 40,000 cadets lived in the sprawling barracks complex surrounding a fusion reactor that powered the entire facility, and the academy was considered one of the most secure installations in the Dominion. A single Reaper, codenamed Lullaby, arrived on Drek 4 alone. She did not kill anyone. She infiltrated the academy during a night cycle and moved through corridors filled with sleeping cadets without waking a single one. And she reached the reactor complex and dismantled its containment protocols with such delicate precision that the safety systems triggered an automatic evacuation rather than a meltdown. And 40,000 cadets poured out of the barracks into the frozen tundra in their sleeping clothes with no supplies and no vehicles, because the emergency protocols had locked everything down. They expected to die in the cold. Instead, they found supply caches waiting for them at every evacuation point. Terran military ration packs arranged in neat rows, with heating units and thermal blankets and medical kits. And attached to each cache was a note, translated into perfect Valhari, that read, "Earth feeds its enemies, the Dominion does not." It was such a simple thing. But those 40,000 cadets had spent their entire lives being told that aliens were inferior, and that humanity was weak and soft, and that the Dominion was the greatest power in the galaxy. And here in the freezing dark, an enemy they had never met had cared more about their survival than their own commanders who had not arrived for 6 hours. Recruitment on Drek 4 dropped by 60% within a month. The cadets talked, and their families talked, and the story spread through the Dominion's military ranks like a virus that no quarantine could contain. The humans did not just kill, they also showed mercy, and somehow the mercy was more frightening than the killing because it meant they were choosing when to be gentle and when to be lethal, and that choice was entirely in their hands. On the industrial world of Vassor, the Dominion's regional intelligence network operated from a series of hidden facilities scattered across the planet's megacities. And the 22 senior intelligence officers who ran those facilities were among the most protected individuals in the sector, with personal guard details and fortified safe houses and encrypted communication systems that were considered unbreakable. 2 Reapers arrived on Vassor. Their code names were Congregation and Quiet Sunday, and over 9 days they hunted every single one of those 22 officers and killed them. Not with explosions or firefights or collateral damage, but with a surgical precision that left the cities around them completely untouched, and the civilians who lived in those megacities went about their daily lives without knowing that a war was being fought in the shadows above them until they saw the news reports describing intelligence officers found dead in rooms that were still locked from the inside. The Valhari citizens began to whisper that the Reapers could tell soldier from civilian by heartbeat alone, that the black armor could hear the difference between a warrior's pulse and a shopkeeper's pulse, and that it only killed the former. This was not true, but Congregation and Quiet Sunday did nothing to correct it, because the myth served them better than the truth, and fear built on mystery was stronger than fear built on fact. And then there was Korath Ascendant, the sacred throne world of the Valhari Dominion, the most heavily defended planet in the Empire, the seat of High Commandant Salith herself, surrounded by a defense fleet of 2,000 warships, and a planetary shield that could withstand orbital bombardment for months. No one attacked Korath Ascendant. No Reaper set foot on its surface, but on a day that would become known in Valhari history as the Day of the Voice, every military communication frequency on the planet, every secure channel, and every encrypted line, and every emergency broadcast system suddenly carried the same transmission. A human voice speaking in flawless High Valhari, the ancient formal dialect used only by the Dominion's ruling class. And the voice belonged to a Reaper known only as Sermon, and no one ever determined where the transmission originated from. "Your generals play strategy," Sermon said, and the words rolled through every barracks and every command center and every warship in orbit. "And ours do not exist, because you are not fighting a military. You are being hunted by individuals who were born wrong and made right, and we want you to understand what that means." There was a pause, and then the voice continued. "It means we do not need supply lines, or reinforcements, or orders from above, and it means every one of us is a complete weapon system capable of operating alone indefinitely. And it means that right now as you listen to this, there are Reapers on worlds you believe are secure, doing things you will not discover for weeks. Stop or do not stop. We prefer when you do not stop, because we were made for this, and some of us have waited our entire lives to be useful." The transmission ended, and the silence it left behind was worse than the words. The galaxy was watching all of it, through intelligence networks and diplomatic channels, and the occasional brave journalist who had managed to embed with Valhari forces. And the Concord ambassadors, who had once expected humanity to surrender quietly, now whispered new words for what Earth had unleashed. The Drenkai called them Kazul, the wrong-shaped mercy, because they killed with one hand and healed with the other, and you never knew which hand was reaching for you. Because they had always thought humanity was gentle, and now they understood that the gentleness was a choice made by a species that had the capacity to be something else entirely. The Valhari soldiers who had faced them on the ground and survived, and there were very few who had, simply called them ghosts. High Commandant Salith sat on her throne on Korath Ascendant, and read the reports from Drek 4 and Vassar, and a dozen other worlds where the Reapers had struck. And she read the analysis from her intelligence division, which now had gaps in it because her intelligence officers kept dying. And she read the psychological assessments which concluded that Valhari military morale was dropping faster than any model had predicted. And she made her decision. If the Reapers could not be caught, and could not be fought, and could not be matched on the ground, then she would not fight them on the ground at all. She would go over them and around them, and she would strike at the thing that these humans cared about most, their people, their civilians, their children. She began assembling the Doomsday Fleet in secret, and as her commanders carried out her orders with the desperate energy of an empire that could feel itself losing control of a war it had started, Salith told herself that this was strategy and not desperation. She was lying, and somewhere deep beneath the throne and the armor, and the 19 cycles of iron rule, she knew it. The Doomsday Fleet assembled in the dead space between star systems, where no sensors reached and no patrols wandered. And High Commandant Salith watched from the bridge of her personal dreadnought, the Iron Vow, as 3,000 warships loaded with planet cracker ordnance fell into formation around her, like an iron fist closing. Each of those ships carried weapons designed to fracture a world's crust and boil its oceans and turn its atmosphere into poison. And they had been built during the Drenkai conquest as a deterrent that was never meant to be used. But Salith had moved beyond deterrence now, and beyond strategy, and beyond anything that resembled rational military thinking, because she was fighting an enemy that did not behave like an enemy, and the old rules had all turned to dust in her hands. Her target was Terran Haven, the human colony on Kepler 442b, a green and blue world orbiting a quiet star, where 1.2 billion human civilians lived their lives in cities and farms and coastal towns. And it was the largest Terran colony outside of Earth itself, and Salith had chosen it because the destruction of that many lives would be a wound that even the humans could not ignore. She broadcast her ultimatum on every frequency the galaxy could hear. To the Terran Union and its agents of shadow, recall your monsters within 72 hours, or we will render Kepler 442b uninhabitable. And every man and woman and child on its surface will burn, and their ashes will serve as a lesson about what happens when a small species provokes a great one. The galaxy held its breath. On Terran Haven the civilians looked up at their sky and knew that somewhere beyond it, 3,000 ships were waiting to kill them. And the colonial government began evacuation procedures, but there were 1.2 billion people, and not enough ships. And everyone knew the math did not work. The Concord issued statements of concern and urged restraint and did absolutely nothing of substance, because the Concord had never done anything of substance, and everyone knew that too. Earth's official channels remained silent, but the Reaper network did not. Across the Dominion, in the hidden spaces between enemy strongholds, 347 Reapers received Salith's ultimatum through intercepted transmissions, and each of them processed it through tactical AIs that calculated odds and threat assessments and optimal response patterns, and each of them reached the same conclusion, that the High Commandant had made this threat precisely because she believed the Reapers could not reach her. One Reaper disagreed with the tactical assessment. Her codename was Matador, and she had been operating solo behind Valhari lines for 11 weeks without resupply or contact with any other human being. And in that time she had moved through the Dominion's core territories like a whisper, supply depots and communication hubs, and killing only when she had to, and vanishing when she did not. Her Mark 7 shroud armor was scarred and patched in a dozen places where enemy fire had come close enough to damage the nanomesh, and the matte black surface that had once been seamless now carried the marks of 11 weeks of solitary war, like a skin that had been broken and healed and broken again. Her tactical AI, which had been designated TAN-7 at deployment, but which she now simply called Tango, had evolved over those 11 weeks from a clinical targeting system into something that resembled a companion. And when Matador told Tango what she intended to do, the AI was quiet for 3 full seconds before responding. The probability of surviving a solo infiltration of the Iron Vow is approximately 4%, Tango said through the Neuralink. What is the probability of 1.2 billion people surviving if I do not try? Matador replied. Did not answer, because they both already knew. Matador had spent 3 of her 11 weeks mapping the Dominion's classified military logistics network. And buried in that network was the Iron Vow's maintenance schedule and crew rotation patterns, and the security codes for its docking systems. Not current codes, but codes from 6 weeks ago. And she gambled that Valhari military bureaucracy was slow enough that at least some of those codes had not been changed. She was right about 40% of them. That was enough. She reached the Iron Vow by hiding inside the cargo bay of a Valhari supply shuttle that docked with the Dreadnought 14 hours before the ultimatum deadline, and she lay motionless in a shipping container for 3 hours, while docking crews moved around her and scanners swept the bay, and her armor's electronic warfare suite worked harder than it had ever worked to convince those scanners that the container held nothing but ration supplies. When the bay cleared, she moved. The Iron Vow was a ship built for 2 purposes: to command fleets and to terrify enemies. And it was enormous, nearly 4 kilometers long, with a crew of 12,000, and a bridge that sat at its heart like the brain of a metal beast. And between Matador and that bridge lay corridors filled with armed guards, and security checkpoints, and automated defense systems, and 200 elite soldiers of the High Commandant's personal guard. Matador did not fight her way through them. She went through the maintenance shafts, and the ventilation systems, and the narrow spaces between the hull layers that the ship's designers had never imagined a human body could fit through. And Tango mapped her route in real time using data stolen from the ship's own internal sensors, turning the Iron Vow's security systems into her navigation guide. It took her 4 hours to reach the bridge level. Occupied the final corridor. 200 Valhari warriors in full combat armor standing shoulder to shoulder in a passage that was designed to be a kill zone for any attacking force. And they were alert and armed and ready, because Salith was not foolish enough to believe she was completely safe, even on her own ship. Matador studied them through a ventilation grate for 6 minutes, and then she asked Tango a question. Can you kill the lights on this deck for 45 seconds? I can kill them for 38, Tango said. That will be enough. The lights died and Matador came through the ventilation grate like something born from the darkness itself. And what happened in the next 38 seconds would never be fully recorded, because the security cameras on that deck were also dark. But when the lights returned 41 seconds later, 3 seconds longer than Tango had promised, because the AI had found a way to push it, 114 of the 200 guards were down. Not dead. Matador had made a choice in those 38 seconds that would be debated by military historians for generations. She had incapacitated rather than killed, breaking limbs and severing tendons, and striking nerve clusters with a precision that left each guard alive but unable to fight. And she had done this not out of mercy, but out of calculation, because dead guards told no stories, and she needed these guards to tell stories. The remaining 86 guards broke and ran because they had seen what 38 seconds of darkness had done to their comrades, and they understood with the bone-deep certainty of combat veterans that they were not equipped to fight whatever was standing in that corridor. Matador walked through the blast doors of the bridge, alone. Salith's bridge crew numbered 200, officers and technicians and communications specialists, and they turned as one when the doors opened. Moments there was silence as 200 Valhari stared at a single figure in scarred black armor, standing in the doorway. Some of them reached for weapons. 11 minutes later, Every single one of them was unconscious on the floor, and the bridge was quiet, and the holographic displays still glowed with fleet positions and tactical data, and the countdown to the ultimatum deadline that now read 6 hours and 12 minutes. Salith was the last one standing. She had drawn a ceremonial blade, a weapon carried by every High Commandant since the founding of the Dominion, and she held it in front of her with both hands, and her golden eyes were wide, and her breathing was fast, and for the first time in 19 cycles of absolute rule, she looked exactly like what she was, a person who had realized too late that she had threatened the wrong species. Matador disarmed her in a single motion, and the blade clattered across the deck, and then the Reaper lifted the High Commandant of the Valhari Dominion by the collar of her ceremonial armor and carried her to an escape pod. Before she sealed the pod, Matador did something that no tactical manual would have recommended and no AI would have suggested. She removed her helmet. Salith stared at the face beneath it and saw a young human woman, perhaps 30 years old, with dark skin and a shaved head, and scars running along her jaw and across her left temple. And her eyes were brown and exhausted, and there were dark circles under them that spoke of weeks without proper sleep. And she was smiling. Not cruelly and not triumphantly, but with the quiet, tired smile of someone who had done something impossibly hard and knew it was not over yet. "You pointed a gun at our children," Matador said, and her voice was hoarse and low and steady. "And I want you to remember this face when you explain to your empire why that was a mistake." She sealed the pod and launched it, tumbled through space, broadcasting on every Valhari frequency, alive and unharmed and utterly defeated, and her own fleet recovered her within minutes, and when they opened the pod and found their High Commandant curled in the fetal position, with her eyes open and her hands shaking, they knew the war was over. On the bridge of the Iron Vow, Matador sat down in the command chair and let herself breathe for the first time in 14 hours, and Tango said quietly through the neural link, "The fleet is standing down." Written on the main display screen in the Valhari word for peace were words that Matador had entered before she sat down. "This is not a negotiation. This is a mercy you have not earned yet." The Doomsday Fleet turned back. On Terran Haven, 1.2 billion people looked up at a sky that was not burning and did not know the name of the woman who had saved them, and they would not learn it for a very long time. 6 months after the Iron Vow incident, the Galactic Concord Hall on Yetheris 9 was full again, but the atmosphere in the chamber was nothing like it had been the last time these species had gathered here, because the last time there had been confidence and certainty, and the comfortable assumption that the galaxy's power structures were fixed and permanent. And now there was only a stunned and humbled silence, like the quiet after a storm that had rearranged the landscape. The Valhari Dominion had not collapsed, and this was deliberate, because Earth had understood something that conquerors throughout history had always failed to grasp. That destroying an empire was easy, but that the rubble of a destroyed empire was more dangerous than the empire itself. And 42 star systems falling into chaos and civil war and famine would have destabilized the entire galactic arm and killed more people than the war ever could. So the Reapers had done something extraordinary. Instead of tearing the Dominion apart, they had shaped its transformation from the inside, with the same precision they had used to dismantle its military. And over those 6 months, they had identified the hardliners in the Dominion's power structure, the commanders and governors and political operatives who would have continued the war or launched a new one, and they had removed them. Some were killed in the shadows, the way the intelligence officers on Vassar had been killed, silently and surgically in the night. But most were not killed at all. Most were simply exposed, their corruption and their crimes and their secret dealings laid bare through intelligence the Reapers had gathered during their weeks behind enemy lines, and the data was delivered anonymously to Valhari journalists and opposition figures and reform movements that had been operating in secret for years, waiting for a moment of weakness in the regime. The Reapers gave them that moment. And at the same time, the Reapers identified and protected the reformists within the Dominion, the military officers who had opposed the Blood Crusade, and the provincial governors who had quietly sheltered Drenkai refugees, and the young politicians who believed the Dominion could be something other than an engine of conquest. And these reformists found that their enemies kept disappearing, and their communications were never intercepted, and their movements were never tracked. And they did not know why until much later. The result was that the Dominion's surrender was not a surrender to Earth at all, but a transformation driven by its own people. A revolution that looked organic to anyone who was not paying very close attention, and that only the most astute galactic analysts recognized as having been carefully and invisibly guided. High Commandant Salif abdicated her throne 1 month after the Iron Vow, and she did so in a public address that was notable for what it did not contain: no defiance, and no threats, and no promises of future vengeance. Just a tired old woman standing before her people and saying that she had led them into a war they could not win against an enemy they did not understand, and that it was time for new leadership that could build something better than conquest. She never spoke publicly about what had happened on the bridge of her ship, and she never described the face she had seen beneath the black helmet. But those who knew her said she was never the same, that something had been taken from her in those final moments, not her life or her freedom, but her certainty. And for a ruler who had built everything on the foundation of absolute confidence, the loss of that certainty was worse than any wound. The Treaty of Ythrus was negotiated over 3 weeks and signed on the same station where Ambassador Elena Voss had delivered her warning 6 months earlier, and the terms were unprecedented in galactic history. The Valhari Dominion would demilitarize its offensive fleet, reducing its warships from 12,000 to 3,000 defensive vessels. The conquered species, the Drenkai and the Siloxi, and the 7 other civilizations that had been absorbed into the Dominion over the past century, would be granted full sovereignty, and their homeworlds would be returned, and reparations would be paid over a period of 50 standard years. A joint Terran Galactic Observer mission would oversee the transition to ensure compliance. And then there was the final clause, the one that made every ambassador in the chamber fall silent when it was read aloud. Earth agreed to recall the Reapers, not disband them, and not decommission them, and not retire them. Recall. The difference between those words was the difference between throwing away a weapon and putting it back in its sheath. And every species in that chamber understood exactly what that. Ambassador Elena Voss returned to the podium to give the closing address, and she looked older than 6 months should have allowed. The gray in her hair had spread, and the lines around her eyes had deepened, and she moved with the careful slowness of someone carrying a weight that no one else could see. She looked out at the chamber, and she did not smile, and she did not perform, and she spoke in the same flat, calm voice that she had used 6 months ago when she had told the galaxy that Earth declined. Earth did not want this war, she said, and we do not breed warriors, and we do not glorify conquest, and we do not teach our children that strength is measured by the number of species you can force to kneel. She paused, and the chamber was so quiet that the ambient hum of the station's life support systems was audible. But we learned something a long time ago, long before we reached the stars, and long before we knew that other species existed. Learned it in our own wars, and our own failures, and our own long, bloody history of hurting each other, and then finding reasons to stop. She placed her hands on the podium, and they were steady. We learned that the gentlest civilizations must carry the sharpest teeth, not to bite, but so that nothing ever makes them. She let that settle, and then she continued. The Reapers are going home. They will raise families, and tend gardens, and teach children, and coach sports teams, and argue with their neighbors about noise, and sit on porches watching sunsets on worlds they fought to protect. And as the galaxy is wise, That is all they will ever do again." Her voice dropped slightly, but every microphone in the chamber caught it. "But they will remember how to be what they were, and so should you." She stepped back from the podium and walked to her seat and sat down and folded her hands in her lap and said nothing more. The chamber was silent for a very long time. In the months that followed, the galactic community wrestled with a new understanding of the species called humanity. And it was an understanding that did not fit neatly into any existing category, because the galaxy had always divided civilizations into predators and prey, and warriors and builders, and conquerors and conquered. And humanity was none of these things, and all of these things at the same time. They were a species that had spent millennia at war with itself, not the ritualized honor wars of the Valhari or the calculated territorial disputes of the Siloxi, but real, grinding, brutal wars fought over religion and land and ideology and resources and pride and fear and every other reason a sapient being could find to kill another sapient being. And they had emerged from those millennia not hardened and not softened, but something else entirely. They had emerged precise. They had distilled violence into something so efficient and so contained, terrifying, that it could be carried by a few hundred individuals in black armor and still bring an interstellar empire to its knees. And they had done it not because they loved war, but because they had hated it so deeply for so long that they had learned to make it as small and as fast and as targeted as possible, so that the rest of their civilization could go on living in the light. A journalist from the Drenkai Independent Press cornered the Drenkai ambassador at a reception after the treaty signing, and asked him what he thought of Earth now. And the ambassador, a tall, four-armed figure with deep-set eyes that had seen his own homeworld conquered, and now freed within the span of a few cycles, paused for a long time before answering. "The Valhari conquered us with armies," he said, "and Earth freed us with ghosts, and I do not know which frightens me more, but I know which one I would rather have as a neighbor." The journalist asked him if he thought humanity was dangerous. The ambassador considered this. "I think," he said slowly, "that humanity is the most dangerous species in this galaxy. And I think that is exactly why they're also the safest species to stand beside. Because they know what they are capable of, and they choose every single day not to be that thing. And that choice, that constant deliberate choice, is what makes them human." He paused again and then added something quieter. "I hope they never stop choosing." Far from the Concord Hall, and far from the treaties and the speeches and the galactic politics, on a quiet colony world orbiting a yellow star that reminded its residents of a home most of them had never seen, a woman knelt in the dirt of a small garden behind a modest house, and planted sunflower seeds in neat rows. Her name was not Matador anymore. It was Maria, and it had always been Maria, and Matador had only ever been the name of the thing she became when her world needed her to become it. Her hands were steady as she worked the soil, and the scars on her jaw and temple caught the afternoon light, and her brown eyes were focused on the simple task of pressing seeds into the earth and covering them gently. And Tango was silent in the back of her mind, not gone, but resting, the tactical AI reduced to a quiet hum like a sleeping companion who would wake instantly if called. The Mark 7 shroud armor stood in the shed behind her house, powered down, but maintained and cleaned and checked every week with the unconscious discipline of someone for whom readiness was not a habit, but an identity. It would never be decommissioned. Maria knew this, and she accepted it, the way she accepted the scars and the nightmares, and the way she sometimes woke in the dark, reaching for a weapon that was not there. Because these were the costs of being what she had been, and they were costs she had agreed to pay, so that the 1.2 billion people on Terran Haven, and the 12 billion people on Earth, and the countless others across the Terran boundary could live without ever knowing those costs existed. She finished planting the last row of sunflowers, and sat back on her heels and looked up at the sky. It was blue and clear and empty and quiet, And the quiet was not the quiet of fear or surrender or the silence between storms. It was the quiet of a galaxy that had learned, for now at least, to let the gentle ones tend their gardens in peace. Maria smiled, and wiped the dirt from her hands, and went inside to make tea. And behind her, the shed door was closed but not locked. It never would be.